There's something magical about the way a story unfolds in the quiet hours, when the world around you softens and the only light comes from the gentle flicker of a fire. Picture this: a cozy hearth in Dor-lómin, where the flames dance and whisper secrets of old, and a child, wrapped in a woolen blanket, leans in closer, eyes wide with wonder. An elder's voice, deep and soothing like a lullaby, begins to weave a tale of golden-haired lords, of courage that defied even the darkest shadows, and of a house whose name echoes through the ages, the House of Hador. Can you feel it? The hush of the room, the weight of history pressing in, the sense that you're about to step into a legend far greater than yourself. Wherever you are right now, whatever hour finds you listening, we'd love to know, what corner of the world are you joining us from tonight? And as the stars outside your window begin their watch, what time does your journey into rest begin? Let us know in the comments below. This is more than just a story. It's an invitation to step into Middle-earth, to walk alongside heroes whose loyalty shone like beacons in the gloom of Morgoth's reign. The House of Hador wasn't just a lineage, it was a promise of honor, of sacrifice, of standing tall when all else seemed lost. Theirs is a tale woven with threads of defiance and devotion, of battles fought not just with swords, but with hearts unbroken. And tonight, as the fire crackles and the night deepens, we'll trace their footsteps together, through triumphs and sorrows, through whispers of destiny and the weight of oaths sworn beneath the stars. So settle in, let the warmth of the story wrap around you like that woolen blanket. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let your imagination carry you to a time when the fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance, when the choices of a few could tilt the scales of light and shadow. This is the House of Hador, a legacy of courage, a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who refuse to bow. And as the elder's voice rises and falls like the wind over the plains of Dor-lómin, we'll follow that golden thread of legend all the way to its breathtaking end. Ready, let's begin. The wind howled across the plains of Dor-lómin, tugging at Hador Lórindol's golden cloak, like an insistent whisper of the times to come. His people called him Lórindol, a golden head, not just for the brightness of his hair, but for the way he stood, unwavering, like the first light of dawn against the gathering dark. Up here on the high hill, with the land stretching beneath him like a tapestry of green and gold, he could almost pretend the shadow of Ang and was just a bad dream. Almost, but the cold weight of his sword beneath his fingers reminded him Morgoth's malice was no illusion. Behind him, the voices of his captains rose and fell in steady discussion, their words sharp with urgency. They spoke of patrols doubled along the borders, of hidden paths watched day and night, of forges hammering out swords and spears with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Hador listened, his gaze drifting northward, where the mountains loomed like broken teeth against the sky. Somewhere beyond them, in the choking smoke of Thangorodrim, the enemy plotted. And yet, here, in the heart of Dor-lómin, laughter still rang from the halls at dusk. Children still chased each other through the tall grass. The golden banners of his house still snapped proudly in the wind. That was worth fighting for, worth dying for if it came to it. He turned back to his men, and the weight of his oath to Finglefin settled over him like a mantle. He had sworn to stand with the High King, to hold this land against the tide of shadow for as long as breath remained in him, and Hador was not a man to break his word. "Double the watch at the ford," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of a command that would not be questioned. "And send word to the outlying farms. Tell them to bring their families within the walls at the first sign of trouble." One of the captains opened his mouth as if to argue, then shut it at the look in Hador's eyes. There was no room for doubt, not now. The enemy did not rest, and neither could they. A gust of wind sent the long grass rippling like water, and for a moment, Hador imagined it was the sea, the same sea his forefathers had crossed in defiance of Morgoth long ago. The same sea that had carried them to these shores, where they had carved out a home from the wilderness with nothing but courage and stubborn hope. He smiled faintly. They had not come this far to falter now. Let the darkness come. The House of Hador would meet it with blades bright and heads held high. The hall of Hador fell silent as the messenger's words hung heavy in the air. Orcs, not just scattered bands, but a tide of them, slipping through the northern passes like shadows given teeth. At the high table, Galdor, his son, clenched his fists, the firelight catching the glint of his impatience. "Every moment we wait, they creep closer," he said, voice tight as a bowstring. "Let me take 50 riders and cut them off before they reach the valley." His hand hovered near the hilt of his sword, as if already feeling the weight of it in battle. But Malach, the old counselor who had advised Hador's father before him, leaned forward, his knotted fingers tracing the carvings on the oak table. "Rashness serves Morgoth, not us," he murmured. "The mountains are a maze of ambushes. Send scouts first, let them mark the paths. Count the numbers, then strike with certainty, not haste." His eyes, sharp as flint, locked onto Hador's. There was no fear in them, only the hard-won wisdom of a man who had seen too many good men fall to traps laid in darkness. Hador exhaled slowly, the weight of the choice pressing down on him like a stone. His people's lives balanced on this decision. Too swift, and he might lead them into slaughter. Too slow, and the enemy could be at their gates by dawn. The hearth's glow painted his face in flickering gold as he turned his gaze from his fiery son to the steady old counselor. "Malach speaks true," he said at last. "But Galdor's blood runs hot for good reason. We will do both." He called for his fastest riders, young men who knew the high trails like their own breath. "Go, count every shadow, return before midnight." As the scouts vanished into the dusk, the hall tensed like a drawn bow. Servants moved quietly, filling cups with spiced mead no one drank. The torches outside guttered in the wind, their light stretching and shrinking like restless spirits. Then hoofbeats. A rider, mud-spattered and wide-eyed, burst into the courtyard. The news he brought turned the air to ice. Not dozens, he gasped. Hundreds, and not just orcs. Wolves with eyes like coals, and things that crawl on too many legs. The enemy wasn't probing. They were marching. Hador's hand went to the golden circlet on his brow, the symbol of his lordship, and for a heartbeat, he seemed to see beyond the walls, to the fields where his people slept, unaware. The storm wasn't coming, it was here. Hador stood before his people in the great hall, the torchlight painting his face in flickering gold. The air smelled of hearth smoke and damp wool, of the last traces of supper, and the sharp tang of oiled steel. Outside, the night pressed close, but here, the gathered folk of Dor-lómin, warriors with scars, earned in 100 skirmishes, farmers whose hands knew the weight of both plow and spear, mothers with children clinging to their skirts, all turned their faces to their lord. And Hador, his voice like deep water over stone, began to speak. "You've heard the tidings," he said, not shouting, but letting each word settle like a stone in a still pool. The shadow gathers, but shadows have gathered before. A murmur ran through the crowd, and he waited, letting them remember the winters they'd weathered, the raids they'd turned back, the years they'd carved from wilderness and held against the creeping dark. Then he lifted his hand, and the murmurs died. Finglefin gave us this land not because it was safe, but because he knew we would make it so. An old woman near the front, her back bent, but her eyes bright, nodded slowly. She'd been a girl when the Elven King first granted Dor-lómin to Hador's house, when the ink on the parchment was still damp with promise. That promise had been kept, season after season, harvest after harvest. Now her grandsons stood beside her, their fingers restless on their spear hafts. Hador stepped down from the dais, moving among his people, close enough to touch. He paused by a young man, barely more than a boy, whose hands shook as he adjusted his shield strap. "Look at me," Hador said, not unkindly, and when the boy did, the Lord touched the golden circlet at his own brow, then the boy's shoulder. "This is not just metal. This is a vow to the High King, to each other." Around them, others straightened, shoulders squaring. A blacksmith, her apron still streaked with soot, hefted her hammer like a scepter. Then Hador turned to the hearth, where the fire burned low but steady. He took a branch from the stack, thrust it into the embers until it caught, then lifted it high. The light leaped across faces, across spear points, across the woven banners of house and kin. "They will come," he said, very softly, "but so will dawn. And when they do," the branch cracked, sending up a shower of sparks, "we will meet them as our fathers met them, with steel, with honor, and with the memory of every oath that binds us." No one cheered. There was no need. The silence itself was the answer, thick with the unspoken things that mattered more than shouts. The scrape of a whetstone on a blade, the creak of leather as someone adjusted their grip, the slow, steady breath of a people who knew the cost of standing, and the greater cost of stepping aside. Outside, the wind moaned against the shutters. Inside, the fire burned on. The night was a living thing in the foothills, breathing cold mist between the trees as Galdor and his riders moved like shadows along the game trails. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the occasional snort of a horse, and the distant, guttural growls that told them they were close, too close. Then, a flicker of movement in the moonlight, an orc scout, hunched and sniffing the air, its yellowed tusks glinting. Galdor raised a fist, and 50 bows drew back as one. The ambush erupted in a storm of arrows and war cries. Galdor's sword flashed like silver fire, cutting through the ragged line of orcs before they could rally. His horse, trained for battle, danced beneath him, hooves crushing black armor as easily as autumn leaves. The fight was fierce but short. These were scouts, not warriors, and soon the ground was littered with twisted bodies. Yet as Galdor dismounted to survey the carnage, his boots sank not into mud, but into a print too large for any natural wolf. The claw marks were deep, the stride impossibly long. And the stench, like rotting meat and sulfur, clung to the air even after the wind shifted. His lieutenant, a grizzled rider named Baron, knelt beside another set of tracks, his face pale. "These aren't from the north," he muttered. "They're fresh and heading south, toward the farms." A murmur rippled through the company. Galdor stared into the darkness beyond the trees, where the foothills sloped down toward the sleeping valleys. Morgoth wasn't just testing their borders. He was encircling them, sending his creatures to cut off escape, to trap them like beasts in a snare. Back in Dor-lómin, the great hall was still lit when Galdor returned. Hador stood by the hearth, his face unreadable as his son recounted what they'd found. The firelight caught the worry in Galdor's eyes as he described the tracks, the size of them, the way the earth had trembled faintly underfoot, as if something massive had passed by unseen. "They are not just wolves," he finished, his voice low. "They're something worse, and they're already behind us." Hador said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached for the map spread across the table, his fingers tracing the southern trails, the thin lines of ink that marked the paths to the farms, the mills, the places where their people lived unguarded. "Double the riders on the southern patrols," he said at last, "and light the beacons. Let every homestead know the storm isn't coming from the north alone." Outside, the wind moaned through the eaves, carrying with it the first faint howl of something that was no longer just a hunter, but a herald. The whispers slithered through Dor-lómin like winter mist, soft, insistent, creeping into the cracks between hearthstones and shield racks. Glóredhel heard them first in the weaving houses, where women spun wool and words with equal skill. "Why should our sons bleed for elvish grudges?" one muttered, her fingers knotting the thread too tight. Another, kneading dough with rough hands, added, "Fingelfin's wars bought us nothing but graves." The words weren't shouted, but they didn't need to be. Fear made them heavy. Glóredhel waited until dusk to bring them to her father. She found him in the armory, running a cloth along the edge of his sword with the same care one might give a sleeping child. Without preamble, she repeated what she'd heard, watching his face. Hador didn't flinch, but his hands stilled. The torchlight caught the silver, threading his golden hair as he exhaled slowly. "Doubt is a quieter enemy than orcs," he said at last, "and harder to fight with steel." The next morning, he walked the village alone, listening, not as a lord, but as a man stopping to mend a splintered fence here, to trade a jest with a potter there. The unease was everywhere, coiled beneath the surface like a snake in the grass. A shepherd, sharpening his shears, avoided Hador's eyes when asked about the coming winter. A young mother rocked her babe too fast, her gaze darting northward, and in the smithy, two apprentices argued in hissed tones about whether Morgoth's wrath would spare those who kept to their own affairs. That night, Hador called no formal council. Instead, he built a fire in the center of the village square and waited. One by one, they came. The doubters, the loyal, the fearful, the fierce. When the circle was full, he spoke, not from a high seat, but from the same hard earth they all shared. "You think the elves dragged us into their war?" His voice was calm, but it carried. "Look around, these walls, these fields who gave them to us, who stood beside us when the first winter nearly broke us." A pause, thick as honey, then softer. "Honor isn't a chain, it's a choice, and choices have weight." From the shadows, Malach stepped forward, his old bones leaning on a staff, carved with the faces of their ancestors. My father fought beside Finglefin at the bitter crossing, he rasped, froze his toes off for it too, a ripple of laughter, nervous but real, but he never called it elvish business, he called it survival. Because some shadows grow until there's nowhere left to hide. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward like tiny, defiant stars. Glóredhel watched the faces around the flames, the way the blacksmith's stubborn jaw loosened, how the shepherd's shoulders dropped as if shedding an invisible burden. The doubt hadn't vanished, but now it had to contend with something stronger, memory. The memory of shared bread after lean harvests, of watching Hador ride out time and again to drag some foolhardy soul back from the borderlands, of the way the High King's banners had once flown beside theirs in a dawn that felt, for a moment, like victory. Hador rose, tossing a fresh log onto the fire. Tomorrow we prepare, not just for battle, for after, because when this storm passes, I intend to sit right here and drink to those who stood firm. He held out his hand, palm up. One by one, others joined theirs to his calloused, scarred, young and old, until the weight of them was a pact heavier than any oath sworn in gold-lit halls. The whispers didn't die that night, but they no longer ruled the dark. The hall of Dor-lómin had never known such light. 100 torches blazed along the walls, their glow dancing across tapestries woven with the deeds of ancestors' hunts and harvests, battles and births, the whole long story of a people carved into the fabric. The long tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar and honeyed apples, of dark bread still steaming from the ovens. Mead horns passed from hand to hand, each sip sweeter than the last, each toast louder than the one before. Even the children, usually shooed to bed by this hour, perched wide-eyed on benches, clutching scraps of pastry as the minstrels plucked their lyres and voices rose in the old songs, songs of crossing the grinding ice, of the first sight of these green valleys, of the golden-haired lord who had led them home. Hador let the noise wash over him, his fingers tracing the carved arms of his chair. Tonight, he wore no armor, no sword at his hip, only the golden circlet and a tunic embroidered by his wife's hands long ago. When he stood, the hall quieted slowly, like a fire settling into embers. He raised his cup, not to the High King or to battle glory, but to the woman grinding grain by the far wall, her sleeves flour dusted, to the shepherd boy who'd braved a landslide to save his flock, to the blacksmith whose hammer had shaped every nail in this very hall. "Look around," he said, his voice rough with something deeper than mead. "These are your brothers, your sisters, the hands that pulled your cart from the mud last spring, the voices that sang your child to sleep when fever took them." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not agreement, not dissent, but recognition. In the corner, Malach nodded into his beard, while Glóredhel pressed her palms together, as if holding a fragile truth between them. Hador stepped down from the high table, moving among his people, clasping wrists, touching shoulders. He paused by a young couple, their newborn swaddled between them. "What's his name?" The father, barely more than a boy himself, swallowed hard. "Hador, Lord, after your father." Hador's throat tightened. He touched the babe's cheek, so knew it still carried the warmth of another world. "Then he's already blessed," he murmured. The feast surged on, jests and jigs, boasts and ballads. But as the night deepened, Hador found himself at the open doors, staring north. The music behind him seemed suddenly faint against the vast silence of the mountains. Out there, Beyond the firelight's reach, the wind scoured the high passes where no watchfires burned. His fingers curled against the door frame. This warmth, this light was what Morgoth sought to extinguish. Not just lives, but the way a people turned grief into song. How a shared loaf could mend a quarrel. How a child's name could stitch the past to the future. A hand touched his elbow. Galdor stood beside him, holding out a fresh cup. "They'll remember tonight," his son said quietly. Hador took the mead but didn't drink. "Aye, and so will I." Behind them, the minstrels struck up the lay of the golden star, and 100 voices rose to carry it home. The sound wrapped around Hador like armor, like a promise that no matter what crept in the darkness, some lights refused to be swallowed. The first smoke rose at dawn, thin and black against the pale sky, a stain spreading above the distant homesteads. By the time the scouts returned, their horses lathered and wild-eyed, the air already carried the stench of burning thatch and charred earth. "Wargs," gasped the lead rider, his voice raw as if the smoke had clawed his throat. "Not just beasts ridden, they're torching everything, driving folk toward the mountains like game." His fingers trembled where they gripped the reins, leaving smears of soot on the leather. Hador's council erupted. Galdor slammed his fist onto the table, sending a clay cup rolling to the floor where it shattered like the fragile piece of the valley. "We meet them now, before they reach the inner fields." His eyes burned brighter than the hearth flames. "Every moment we wait, they grow bolder." Around him, younger warriors murmured agreement, their hands restless on their sword hilts. But Hador stood motionless by the window, watching the smoke pillars multiply on the horizon. His silence was a weight that stilled the room. When he turned at last, his face was carved from the same stone as the mountains at his back. "Messengers," he said, and the word was a command. "To Finglefin, to the Falothrim by the sea, to every steadfast house between here and the Syrian." His gaze swept the room, lingering on each face, the fiery, the fearful, the steady. "This is no raid, it's a snare. They want us to chase shadows while the real blade slips between our ribs." Galdor exhaled sharply, his protest coiled tight in his chest. But before he could speak, Malach limped forward, his old fingers tracing the scarred map on the table. The wolf riders moved swift as poison in a wound, he rasped. But even poison follows veins. Here, his nail tapped the river ford, and here, where the old watchtower stands. "These are the paths they'll take to pen us in." Hador nodded once. "Then we hold those points like anvils and let them break upon us." He clasped Galdor's shoulder, feeling the tension there like drawn bowstrings. "I need you at the ford, not to charge, but to stand, to be the wall they cannot pass." For a heartbeat, father and son locked eyes, one tempered by decades of losses and narrow victories, the other alight with the terrible beauty of a first great storm. Then Galdor bowed his head. As the war horns sounded muster, the women of Dor-lómin worked alongside the men, bundling arrows, filling water skins, herding the children and the elderly into the caverns beneath the hall. No tears were shed, though here and there, hands lingered, a mother pressing her lips to a toddler's palm before passing them to an elder, a sweetheart tucking a sprig of rosemary into a warrior's belt. The air thickened with the scent of crushed herbs and hot iron as the forges roared back to life, hammering out last-minute repairs. Night fell too soon. Beyond the palisade, The darkness stirred with sounds no natural night should hold, the scrape of claws on stone, the wet snuffling of nostrils testing the wind. Then came the howls, rising and falling in waves, closer each time. From the walls, the sentries gripped their spears tighter, their breath fogging in the sudden cold. Somewhere out there, eyes like smoldering coals watched, waited. The wind shifted, carrying the reek of wet fur and old blood. Inside the hall, Hador knelt before the great hearth, stirring the embers with a poker until they flared anew. The light caught the golden threads in his circlet, the scars on his knuckles, the quiet resolve in his face as he murmured the old words, not a prayer, but a reminder. Fire endures, he said to the empty room. Then he rose, took up his sword, and went to meet the long night. The first arrows fell like black rain, hissing as they sliced through the dawn mist. Hador didn't flinch when one grazed his cheek. Leaving a thin red line, he merely tightened his grip on his shield and roared the order to hold. The gates of Dor-lómin shuddered under the weight of the enemy's charge, but the timbers, hewn from oaks older than the kingdom itself, held firm. Behind him, the archers loosed volley after volley, their bowstrings singing a deadly chorus. The sky darkened with shafts, and where they landed, the earth sprouted not wheat or wildflowers, but writhing shadows that choked on their own black blood. Galdor fought like a man possessed, his sword arm rising and falling in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. The ford was a slaughterhouse now, the water frothing crimson as wargs, and their riders fell beneath his blade. Yet for every foe that crumpled, two more seemed to rise from the mist. His shield was splintered, his cloak torn, but his laughter bright and fierce, cut through the din. "Is this all?" he shouted to the snarling mass before him, kicking a severed orc head into their ranks. The defiance in his voice was a spark in the gloom, and the men around him rallied, their answering cries weaving into the wind like a promise. Then the horn sounded, not the deep, resonant call of Dor-lómin's sentinels, but a note so cold it seemed to freeze the blood in their veins. From the eastern ridge, a new shadow spilled, tall, terrible, and clad in armor that drank the light. Balrogs, the very air trembled as their whips cracked, splitting stone and flesh alike. Hador's breath caught. He'd heard tales of these demons, how they had broken kingdoms and turned heroes to ash. But tales were one thing, the reek of sulfur, the way the ground smoldered beneath their steps, that was another. Malach, his old bones somehow still upright on the wall, grabbed Hador's arm. "Fall back to the inner keep," he rasped, his voice raw from shouting orders. "The gates won't hold against them." Hador shook his head, his gaze fixed on the approaching storm. "There is no inner keep against this," he said softly, then louder, so his voice carried to every ear still straining to hear him. "Shield wall, spears to the front. If we are to greet the dawn, let it be through them." The men of Dor-lómin, farmers and shepherds and blacksmiths all, locked their shields without hesitation. There was no time for fear, no room for doubt, only the press of shoulders, the shared breath before the plunge. The golden banner of Hador's house snapped above them, its embroidered star blazing defiantly against the smoke. And as the first Balrog raised its whip, its eyes like pits into some unfathomable dark, Hador lifted his sword, not in desperation, but in welcome. "Come then," he murmured, though only the wind could hear it. "Let us see whose fire burns brighter." The clash was thunder given form. Spears shattered against demon flesh, their tips glowing red hot, before crumbling to ash. Men fell, their names lost beneath the roar of flame and the screams of dying horses. Yet still the shield wall held, bending but not breaking, even as the Balrog's laughter rolled over them like a wave of embers. Hador fought at the center of it all, his sword singing a song older than the walls he defended. Every stroke cost him, a gash here, a burn there, but his voice never wavered, calling the line tighter, steadier, closer. And then, just as the sun breached the horizon, as if the very sky could no longer bear to watch, the earth itself seemed to cry out. A tremor ran through the battlefield, so violent it threw friend and foe alike to their knees. From the west, a new sound rose, silver horns, clear as starlight. The banners that appeared on the ridge were not black, nor red, but a blue so deep it hurt to look upon. Finglefin had come. The Balrogs hesitated. For the first time since the dawn of the world, something like uncertainty flickered in their hellish eyes. Hador, bleeding from a dozen wounds, straightened slowly. He didn't smile. There would be time for that later, if they lived. But as he raised his sword once more, the light catching the golden star at its hilt, the men around him did. "Well," Galdor panted, wiping blood from his lips, "shall we finish this?" The answer was a roar that shook the mountains. The battlefield was a storm of steel and screams when Malach fell. Not in some grand last stand atop the walls, but in the mud beside a burning farmhouse, his old bones moving faster than they had in years to shield a child scrambling for cover. The spear that took him was crude, orc work, blackened at the tip, but it found the gap beneath his ribs all the same. By the time Hador reached him, the blood had already seeped deep into the earth, darker than the wine they'd shared at last night's feast. Kneeling, Hador cradled the old man's head, his fingers tangling in the grizzled beard that had always smelled faintly of pipe smoke and sage. Around them, the battle raged, hoofbeats, war cries, the hiss of arrows finding homes in flesh. But here, in this fragile pocket of stillness, even the wind held its breath. Malach's eyes, clouded with pain, fixed on Hador's face. "Listen," he gasped, each word a labor. "This attack, it's no raid, they knew where to strike. Knew our weak points like their own hands." A cough rattled his chest, and when he spat, the ground drank crimson. Someone told them, the words struck harder than any blade. Hador's grip tightened, not in anger, but as if he could press the truth back into his friend's lips, unmake it. Malach had been there when the first stones of Dor-lómin were laid. Had taught Hador's father how to read the weather in the flight of birds. Had laughed, just hours ago, as he stuffed his pockets with oatcakes for the village children. Now his breath came in shallow drags, his fingers clutching at Hador's wrist with surprising strength. The enemy has eyes where we least expect. Trust no one beyond these walls. His other hand twitched toward the child huddled nearby, a girl no older than 6, her face streaked with ash and tears. But this is worth the bleeding. Then his body arched, a shudder running through him like a plucked harpstring. The light in his eyes didn't fade so much as settle, as if he'd finally seen some distant shore and found it good. Hador didn't close them. Let the last thing Malach saw be the sky, the same sky that had watched over their people since the first crossing. When he stood, the grief inside him was a cold, sharp thing, but the fury, that was a living fire. It sang in his blood as he lifted Malach's dagger from the mud, its edge still bright despite the filth. Around him, the battle's tide was turning. He could see Galdor's banner wavering near the ford, could hear the panicked whinnies of horses as the Balrogs advanced. Every instinct screamed to charge into the thick of it, to let the rage take him until either the enemy or his own heart gave out. But Malach's warning echoed louder. Morgoth had played them like fools, luring their strength to the borders, while his true knives slipped between their ribs. Hador turned to the girl, still trembling in the trampled barley. "Run to the hall," he said, pressing the dagger into her small hands. "Tell them to sound the retreat, all who live to the inner keep." Now, as she darted away, Hador took one last look at Malach's still form. No time for rites, no time for tears, only the grim arithmetic of war. What could be saved and what must be surrendered? He raised his horn to his lips and blew a note that cut through the din like a blade through silk. Not the bold call to charge, nor the desperate wail of defeat, but something older, the same 3 tones their ancestors had used to gather the scattered flocks before a blizzard. "Come home, come home, come home." Somewhere in the chaos, Galdor heard it. The Falathrim heard it. Even the Balrogs paused, their hellish heads tilting at the sound. And as the survivors began to fall back, stepping over the bodies of friends and foes alike, Hador planted his boots in the bloodied earth and faced the storm alone. Just for a moment, just long enough to whisper, "I'll see you in the dawn, old friend." Then he turned, his sword bright as a promise, and walked into the fire. Glóredhel did not wait for the final words of her father's command to leave her lips before she was moving. The moment Hador's hand had touched her shoulder, his grip tight with the unspoken weight of all that hung in the balance, she knew her path. The stables were a blur as she saddled her mare Swiftfoot, a beast bred for the moors, with a coat like storm clouds and a heart that matched her own. At her side, young Hador, barely 16, but already one of the fastest riders in Dor-lómin, adjusted his quiver with shaking hands. "East," Hador had said, his voice low and urgent. "Midros holds Himring still. If any can reach us in time, it's him." The gates groaned open, just wide enough to let them slip through, the last sliver of safety vanishing behind them like a snuffed candle. The wind carried the stench of burning thatch even here, miles from the front lines, and beneath it, the distant, jagged howls of wargs on the hunt. Glóredhel didn't look back. To look back was to see the smoke staining the sky above her home, to count the seconds slipping away like grains of sand through a clenched fist. Instead, she bent low over Swiftfoot's neck and let the mare fly. The land unfurled beneath them, treacherous in its beauty. Golden meadows, still untouched by war, rippled like a sea under the moon's pale gaze. Streams glittered cold and clear as cut glass, their banks soft with moss that muffled the drum of hooves. But every shadow could hide claws, every thicket might rustle with ambush. Glóredhel's fingers brushed the dagger at her belt, her mother's its hilt worn smooth from years of tending herbs, not spilling blood, and she wondered if she'd have the stomach to use it when the moment came. Hador rode like one possessed, his youth lending him a reckless speed that nearly outpaced her twice. The high pass, he shouted over the wind, pointing to where the land twisted upward into knife-edged ridges. "It's the shortest way." Glóredhel shook her head, her braid whipping like a pennant behind her. "Too open, we'd be seen for leagues." She veered left, toward the tangled woods along the river's bend. Slower, yes, but the trees would swallow them whole. The first arrow took Hador's horse in the flank. The scream of the animal was a living thing, raw and terrible, as it stumbled, sending the boy sprawling into the bracken. Glóredhel wheeled Swiftfoot around, her own cry lost in the sudden thunder of wings overhead. Crows, no. Too large, too deliberate. The shapes circled once, twice, then dove. She had only a heartbeat to see the pallid faces beneath those black hoods, the glint of curved blades in their hands, before instinct took over. Her dagger found a throat. Hot blood sprayed across her knuckles. Hador, scrambling to his feet, loosed 3 arrows in quick succession, each finding its mark with a sickening thud. No time to breathe, no time to mourn the fallen mare. They ran now on foot, the trees closing around them like a shield. The river's roar drowned their panting, the rush of white water masking the sounds of pursuit. Or so they prayed. When they finally collapsed on the far bank, chests heaving, Glóredhel pressed her forehead to the damp earth and listened not for enemies, but for something far more fragile. The distant, faint echo of horns, Dor-lómin's horns, still blowing, still holding. Hador's voice was a cracked whisper. Do you think they can last? Glóredhel squeezed her eyes shut, seeing her father's face as he looked at her in the torchlight, not afraid, but fiercely proud. He will, she said, pushing to her feet. But only if we move. Ahead, the first slopes of Himring loomed, their peaks veiled in mist. Somewhere beyond them, Medros kept his fires burning. Somewhere beyond them, hope still lived. She grabbed Hador's hand, pulling him forward into the dark. The walls of Dor-lómin groaned under the weight of the siege, their timbers creaking like old bones in the wind. Outside, the enemy's fires burned in a ring around the stronghold, painting the night in flickering orange and black, while the stench of charred earth and iron seeped through every crack. Inside, the halls had become a world of shadows and whispers. The wounded lay shoulder to shoulder on pallets of straw, their bandages stark white against the gloom, while children curled in corners, their wide eyes reflecting the last guttering torchlight. The granaries, once bursting with harvest, stood nearly empty, their wooden floors swept clean as bone. Yet through it all, Hador walked. He moved slowly, his boots scuffing against the flagstones where blood and herbs had left their stains. Here, he knelt beside a young spearman, pressing a cup of willow bark tea into shaking hands. There, he paused to listen as an old weaver recounted between coughs how she'd outlasted the long winter by stitching her family's cloaks from nettle fiber. His laughter, when it came, was a rumble that seemed to shake the very dust from the rafters. Aye, and you'll outlast this too, he said, squeezing her shoulder. Around them, others leaned closer, drawn not just by the words, but by the way he carried himself, shoulders straight, head high, as if the weight of the siege were no heavier than a summer cloak. In the great hall, where the hearth fire burned low, he gathered the children. Their faces were too thin, their laughter too quiet, but when Hador began to speak, their breath stilled. He told them of the fell winter, when the wolves came down from the mountains, and the rivers froze solid enough to march an army across. Your grandparents survived that, he murmured, tracing a finger through the ashes on the hearthstone, drawing a star, the same one that adorned his banners. Not by strength alone, but by remembering that winter always ends. A small hand reached out, smudging the lines, and Hador caught it gently. You'll see spring again. I promise." The words were brave, but the truth hung thick in the air. The enemy's drums had not ceased for 3 days. Their scouts reported no gaps in the encircling forces. No sign of the relief riders Glóredhel had been sent to summon. Yet when a boy no older than 10 asked if they would all die here, Hador did not flinch. He lifted the child onto the high table, where all could see, and placed his golden circlet on the boy's brow. "This," he said, tapping the metal, "is just a circle. What matters is what's inside it." He touched the boy's chest, then his own. Same fire, same fight. That night, as the wind carried the howls of wargs to the very gates, Hador climbed the watchtower alone. Below him, Dor-lómin lay like a ship adrift in a sea of fire, its decks crowded with the living and the dying. To the east, the mountains were a jagged black tear against the sky. No signal fires, no answering horns, just silence. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold. They could not hold forever, but they could hold until dawn, and then the next, and the next after that. Back in the hall, someone began to sing, a lullaby from the days before the crossing, when the world was wider and the stars closer. One by one, other voices joined, weaving a fragile tapestry of sound that seeped through the cracks in the shutters, through the chinks in the walls, out into the night where the enemy's fires burned. It was not defiance, not quite, but it was something warmer than surrender, something like a spark in the wind. The arrow struck the watchtower with a thud that echoed louder than any war drum, its shaft quivering like a plucked harpstring long after the impact. In the pre-dawn gloom, the sentry nearly missed the scrap of parchment, lashed to it, frayed at the edges, smudged with what might have been mud or blood. The words, scratched in haste, were few. Himring's banner sighted at daybreak. The sentry's hands shook as he passed it to Hador, who stood motionless for 3 heartbeats, the parchment crinkling in his grip. Then, just for the space of a single breath, the lines around his eyes softened, a smile, fleeting as a spark in the wind, before he turned to the eastern ramparts, where the sky was still stubbornly black. It wasn't hope that straightened the spines of the men who heard the news. Hope was too fragile a thing for a dawn like this. No, it was something older, deeper, the same instinct that makes a wolf bare its teeth, even as the trap closes. Cooks handed out the last crusts of bread with hands that didn't tremble. Blacksmiths hammered dents from shields with blows that rang like temple bells. And the children, those quiet shadows who'd learned too young the weight of a sword's scabbard, stopped flinching at every distant howl. But the enemy had ears too. By mid-morning, their drums changed rhythm, no longer the steady, mocking thud-thud, thud of a siege, but the frenzied staccato of a storm about to break. From the walls, the sentries watched as siege engines were dragged forward, their iron spikes glistening with something wet and dark. Wargs paced in tight circles, their handlers whispering words that made the beasts froth at the jaws. And high above it all, perched on a skeletal outcropping of rock, a figure in black robes lifted arms too long for any human limb, conducting the dread symphony below. Hador climbed the battlements, his golden circlet dulled by ash and sweat. Below him, the land itself seemed to recoil, birds silent in the trees, the river choked with debris, even the wind holding its breath. He touched the arrow still embedded in the tower's wood, his fingers tracing the fletching, red feathers, Midro's mark, ready the oil, he said to no one and everyone. And the children, to the cellars. His voice carried no hesitation, but his hand lingered on the arrow a moment too long, as if memorizing the shape of its promise. Then the world split open. The first boulder struck the gates like a fist from the heavens, splintering oak and iron alike. The second took the eastern tower, sending stones screaming through the air. Through the dust and chaos, Hador bellowed orders, his sword flashing as he rallied the archers to the gaps. They loosed volley after volley, but the enemy came on, a tide of snarling flesh and black steel. At the breach, Galdor fought like a man already dead, or perhaps one who knew death wouldn't have him today. His laughter rang above the din as he hacked through a warg's spine, his armor slick with gore. High above, the robed figure raised its arms again, and the very air curdled. Shadows pooled at its feet, twisting into shapes with too many legs, too many eyes. They skittered down the rocks toward the fray, their chittering a sound no living throat should make. Hador's gut clenched. This was it, the moment Malach had warned of, when the enemy's true knives came out. Then, as if in answer, a horn call shattered the gloom, not from the east, where Midro's forces should have been, but from the west, a note so pure it seemed to scour the filth from the air. Every head turned, every weapon stilled, and there, cresting the hill like a wave of silver and steel, rode banners no one had dared dream of, Fingelfin's host, their spears tipped with dawn's first light. The robed figure shrieked, a sound that cracked the rocks beneath it. The shadows recoiled, hissing, and Hador, his sword arm aching, his breath coming in ragged gasps, did not cheer. He simply nodded, as if he'd known all along that the world held this one last mercy. Now, he murmured to the arrow still trembling in the wood beside him. Now we fight. The gates groaned like a living thing, each impact of the siege engines sending tremors through the very stones of Dor-lómin. Hador stood in the armory, the air thick with the scent of oil and sweat, as he fastened the last strap of his breastplate. The metal was scarred from 100 battles, the golden inlay along the edges worn thin in places, but it still gleamed dully in the torchlight. Around him, his warriors moved in silence, sharpening blades, adjusting helms, tightening buckles, each motion measured, deliberate. There was no panic in their hands, no hesitation in their eyes, only the quiet certainty of those who had long since counted the cost and found it worth the price. When he stepped into the courtyard, the first light of dawn was just staining the smoke-choked sky. His people waited for him, not just soldiers, but blacksmiths with hammers still soot-streaked, shepherds gripping spears instead of crooks, mothers who had traded their spindle whorls for daggers. Hador didn't climb a platform or raise his voice. He simply walked among them, pausing here to clasp a wrist, there to meet a gaze. "Stand together," he said, the words barely louder than the wind. No grand speech, no promises of glory, just 3 words, heavy as an anvil. The gates splintered with a crack like thunder. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the tide broke through. Orcs, wargs, creatures with too many limbs and too many teeth, all howling for blood. The men of Dor-lómin didn't charge, they didn't scream. They simply stepped forward, shoulder to shoulder, blades raised, and met the storm. Steel rang against steel, a cacophony that drowned even the roar of the enemy. Galdor fought at his father's side, his sword moving like liquid light, every stroke precise, every breath measured. A warg lunged, jaws snapping, and Hador swung his axe in an arc that split its skull clean through. The impact shuddered up his arms, but he was already turning, already blocking the next blow, the next. Around him, the shield wall held not as an unbroken line, but as a living thing, flexing and reforming with each fallen comrade, each new breach. Then came the Balrogs. Their whipfire lashed the air, searing flesh and stone alike. The heat of them was a physical weight, pressing down like a smith's forge. Hador felt his skin blister, his breath scorch his lungs, but he didn't step back. Couldn't, not when the boy behind him, Hador, barely old enough to shave, was still swinging his notched sword with shaking hands. Not when the old weaver from the village was hobbling forward with a spear in her gnarled grip. A whip coiled around Hador's ankle, yanking him to his knees. The pain was white-hot, unbearable, but worse was the sound of the walls crumbling behind him, the knowledge that this was the end. Yet as the Balrog loomed over him, its breath reeking of sulfur and slaughter, Hador grinned through bloody teeth, because beyond the demon's shoulder, beyond the smoke and ruin, a horn call split the sky, clear, bright, undeniable. Not the deep bellow of Morgoth's forces, but the silver cry of the elven host. The Balrog hesitated, just for a heartbeat, just long enough for Hador to wrench his axe free and bury it in the creature's thigh. It howled, the sound shaking the very earth, but the men of Dor-lómin didn't falter. They surged forward, not with the wild frenzy of desperation, but with the terrible, patient certainty of a river carving through stone. They had held, they were still holding, and now, at last, the dawn was coming. The air burned in Hador's lungs, each breath a ragged pull of smoke and blood. Around him, the battle had dissolved into a nightmare of clashing steel and dying screams. His axe moved on instinct now, its edge dulled from striking bone and armor, yet still it rose and fell with the terrible precision of a storm tide. The Balrog's whip had left his leg a ruin of charred flesh, but he had to stand, as his men formed a shrinking circle at his back. Galdor was down somewhere in the fray, his laughter silenced at last. The banner of the Golden Star, held aloft by young Hador until an orc's spear took him through the throat, now lay trampled in the mud. Yet somehow, impossibly, the pole still stood, its splintered shaft jutting from the carnage like a defiant finger raised to the sky. Hador's vision blurred at the edges, the world narrowing to the next foe, the next parry. A troll loomed before him, its club crusted with the remains of someone who'd worn Dor-lómin's colors. He ducked the swing, felt the wind of it ruffle his hair, and drove his axe deep into the creature's belly. Black blood gouted over his hands, stinking of rot, but the troll only laughed, a sound like stones grinding, and back handed him into the wreckage of a barricade. Wood splintered beneath him. Something in his ribs gave way with a wet crack. For a moment, the noise of the battle seemed to mute. The pain was distant, unimportant. Above him, the smoke parted just enough to reveal a slice of sky. Pale blue, indifferent, the same sky that had watched his people cross the grinding ice, that had witnessed his first breath, his first oath. His fingers scrabbled in the dirt, found the haft of a broken spear, not enough to rise, not enough to fight, but enough to lean on, to drag himself upright one last time. The troll was turning away, already hunting fresher prey. Hador's voice, when it came, was a ruin. Oi! The creature paused, its piggish eyes narrowing. You forgot something. With the last of his strength, Hador hurled the splintered spear. It wasn't the clean throw of his youth, nor the killing strike of his prime. It wobbled off balance and buried itself in the troll's thigh. A scratch, a pinprick, but the insult of it made the beast roar, its club rising for the final blow. Hador didn't flinch. His gaze slid past the troll, past the ruin of his home, to where the banner's tattered cloth still fluttered, caught on a spearhead, perhaps, or the fingers of some fallen hero. The gold thread of the star gleamed dully through the filth. Still flying, he thought, as the club descended. Still ours. The impact was a white-hot burst, then nothing. No pain, no sound, only the star, burning bright against the dark, as the world slipped away. The fires of Dor-lómin burned low at last, their embers cooling into ash beneath a sky, heavy with unshed rain. Galdor woke to silence, not the quiet of peace, but the hollow stillness that follows a storm's fury. Every breath tasted of smoke and iron. His fingers, stiff with dried blood, found the broken shaft of a spear, buried in the mud beside him. He used it to drag himself upright, his body a map of wounds both seen and unseen. Around him, the battlefield lay like a plundered grave, the golden banners trampled, the walls reduced to jagged teeth of stone, the air thick with the keening of crows. Yet amid the wreckage, something flickered movement near the ruined gates, a flash of familiar auburn hair. Glóredhel, she knelt beside a fallen elf, her hands pressing a scrap of cloth to a wound that wept silver blood. When she looked up, her face was streaked with soot and tears, but her voice held steady as she called to him. "They came," she said, nodding toward the eastern ridge where the last of Fingelfin's host stood vigil, their blue banners stark against the dawn. Not in time to save, but in time to witness. Galdor limped to her side, his boot heels sinking into earth, churned soft by hooves and terror. The elf, one of Midro's captains, by the crest on his pauldron, gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Your father," he rasped, his accent curling around the words like smoke. "His name will be sung in our halls until the mountains crumble." The promise should have been a comfort. Instead, it settled in Galdor's chest like a stone. Names sung were no substitute for hands clasped, for laughter shared around a hearth. Yet when he looked down at his sister, at the way her jaw tightened as she tied off the bandage, he understood. This was the legacy Hador had left them, not just a broken stronghold, but the unyielding will to rise from its ruins. The child by the fire, wide-eyed and breathless, leans closer now as the elder's voice drops to a whisper. "Do you see?" the storyteller murmurs, stirring the embers with a stick until they flare anew. "The measure of a house isn't in the stones that shelter it, but in the sparks it leaves behind." Outside, the wind moans through the pines, but here, in the circle of firelight, the air hums with something fiercer than grief. The boy touches the golden thread woven into the edge of his blanket, a gift, perhaps, from some long-ago ancestor who once rode beneath Hador's banner. He doesn't ask if the heroes won. He already knows better. Heroes seldom do, but the ones worth remembering, they're the ones who refuse to let the story end with the falling of the walls. And so the tale winds onward, as tales do. Galdor and Glóredhel, their backs straight despite the weight of their scars, ride east with the elven host. Not as refugees, but as torchbearers. Dor-lómin's halls may lie in ruin, but its people, they're scattered now like embers on the wind, to hidden valleys, to mountain holds, to the very shores of the sea. And wherever they go, they carry two things: the memory of golden-haired Hador, standing unbowed before the storm, and the quiet, unspoken vow that flames, once kindled, are not so easily snuffed out. The storyteller leans back, letting the silence stretch. Some truths don't need grand proclamations. Some victories are measured not in battles won, but in the way a child's fingers tighten around that golden thread, in the way his breath comes quicker as he imagines riding someday beneath a banner of his own. The fire pops, sending up a shower of sparks. Somewhere beyond the circle of light, an owl calls, and the House of Hador, it lives on not in stone or steel, but in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause before the next defiant step forward. The elder's voice grows softer now, weaving the last threads of the tale like a whisper of wind through ancient trees. Even the valor remember, he murmurs, his words barely stirring the embers in the hearth. When Varda kindled the stars, she set some apart, not just for light, but to bear witness, to hold the names of those who stood unbowed. The child's eyelids flutter, his breath slow and steady, but his fingers still clutch the edge of his blanket, as if afraid to let the story slip away. In the dimming firelight, the images dance behind his closed eyes, golden-haired warriors, riding beneath a sky alight with constellations, their swords catching the gleam of distant, watching stars. The hearth's glow fades to a faint pulse, the shadows stretching long across the floor. Outside, the night is vast and silent, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm. The elder leans back, his own eyes drifting to the window where the first evening stars now pierce the dark. They say, he continues, so softly the words might be mistaken for a sigh, that when a man of Hador's line falls, a new star flickers to life, not to mourn, but to guide. To remind us that courage isn't measured in years, but in echoes. A log shifts in the fire, sending up a final shower of sparks, and for a heartbeat, the room is alive with their fleeting light. The child's grip loosens at last, his hand sliding into the warmth of the wool beneath him. His dreams are already pulling him under visions of high towers and banners, snapping in a wind that smells of pine and distant seas. The elder watches him a moment longer, then reaches for the worn leather book beside him, its pages filled with names and battles, victories and losses. He doesn't open it. Some stories don't need ink to endure. Beyond the window, the stars burn colder now, brighter. They've seen kingdoms rise and crumble, watched oaths sworn and broken, witnessed the slow, patient turning of the world. And if you really listen on nights like this, when the wind stills and the fire sinks into ash, you might hear it, the faintest hum of a song older than the mountains. A song that remembers golden hair and unyielding hearts, that whispers of a house whose defiance still kindles the dark. The elder closes his eyes. The tale is done. But the stars, they're just beginning. The elder's fingers linger on the edge of the blanket, smoothing a wrinkle that doesn't exist, as if the act itself could ward off the night's chill, or the weight of the tale just told. The child's breaths come slow and even now, his lashes casting delicate shadows on cheeks, still round with youth. For a moment, the old man hesitates, his hand hovering above the boy's forehead, where a single curl, bright as summer wheat, has escaped its braid. Then, with a touch lighter than a moth's wing, he traces a shape there, a star, the same one embroidered on the banners of the fallen. The blessing isn't spoken aloud. Some things don't need words to be true. Outside, the wind rises, rushing through the pines with a sound like distant hoofbeats, like the sigh of a forgotten shore. And there, just beneath the creak of branches, another note threads through the dark. Faint, almost imagined, the echo of a horn blown centuries ago, its call stretched thin by time, but unbroken. The elder's head lifts, his eyes finding the window where the last embers of twilight bleed into the horizon. He doesn't startle. He's heard this sound before, on nights when the world feels too quiet, when the stories press close against his ribs. It isn't a summons, it isn't a warning, it's simply a reminder that valor, once kindled, never truly fades. It lingers in the turn of a river, in the scent of rain on parched earth, in the way a child's fingers tighten around a golden thread in his sleep. The hearth fire sputters, its light guttering low, but the stars beyond the glass burn steady. They always do. Somewhere beneath them, in hidden valleys and by lonely shores, others are listening tonight, to different tales, perhaps, but the same heart beating beneath the words. A smith in a mountain forge pauses mid-stroke, his hammer hovering as the wind carries a strain of an old melody. A fisherwoman on the far coast lifts her face to the spray, salt on her lips and a whisper of golden hair in her memory. The tale of the House of Hador isn't just a story. It's a torch passed hand to hand in the dark, its flame flickering but never extinguished. The elder closes the book beside him, its leather cover worn soft by generations of hands. He doesn't mark the page. Stories like this don't need bookmarks. They live in the spaces between breaths, in the quiet after the last word is spoken. The wind murmurs against the shutters, and for a heartbeat, it almost sounds like laughter, bright and brave and impossibly young. The child stirs, his lips curving in some unspoken dream, and the old man smiles. Outside, the stars shine on, and the night, for all its vastness, feels less empty than before.